Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this program. We're really pleased that our guest today is Mary Trump, and we'll be talking about how she says her family created the world's most dangerous man.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
What is it like to be related to Donald Trump? Our guest today, Mary L. Trump, has written 2 books about growing up in the extended family of Donald Trump, including the bestseller, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, which sold nearly 1 million copies on its first day of sales. She followed that with a book in 2021, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal, about the failure to address the scourge of white racism. Last year, her haunting family memoir called Who Could Ever Love You came out.
Mary Trump has a literature degree from Tufts, earned a master's in English Lit from Columbia, and is a trained clinical psychologist who holds a PhD from the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies. She's taught graduate courses in trauma, psychopathology, and developmental psychology, and we're delighted that she will be accepting the Freedom from Religion Foundation's Emperor Has No Clothes Award, reserved for individuals who tell it like it is about religion, at our mid-October national conference in South Carolina. And Mary, thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to meet you.
It's wonderful to meet you, and it's such an honor to be here, so thank you for having me.
I can't think of anyone more deserving of this award, because you've spent much of the last 8 or 9 years saying the emperor has no clothes, right?
Yeah, I love the name of the award, quite honestly, especially, it's so fitting
Yes.
for Donald in particular. And just to be clear, yes, I have been saying these things for 8 or 9 years, but for the first 4 or 5, it was in the privacy of my own living room, because it wasn't until my first book came out in July 2020 that I finally was able to speak publicly and develop something of a platform, which, you know, was game-changing, because as I'm sure you all remember, that was a pretty crucial time in our history with COVID, the economic crisis, and the looming threats to our democracy in the run-up to the 2020 election.
Yes. And before we talk about your books and your views on the current Trump administration, is it true that you pretty much became an atheist at the age of 16?
Yeah, interestingly, I was a pretty, I don't know if religious is the right word actually, because my family's religious beliefs were quite superficial. My grandfather was a fan, if you will, of Norman Vincent Peale, who had a quite toxic approach to Christianity, and we didn't attend church regularly. We didn't talk about religion. I did, however, believe quite devoutly in God. I wore a cross, which I still find odd, but I didn't at the time, obviously. But then when I was 16, my dad became quite ill, but nobody in my family told me that he was ill, and I went to boarding school not knowing. And then about 2 weeks after school started, I got a phone call telling me that he had died. And for me, this was very unexpected. And because of the circumstances of his life and because of the way my family treated him, and then subsequently me and the rest of my family, I could not reconcile the existence of a higher power with the abject cruelty with which my dad was treated, and with honestly just the horrific circumstances of his later life.
I remember Norman Vincent Peale. He wrote that book, The Power of Positive Thinking, which was very influential.
Yeah.
And do you think your family actually read those books, or were they just going to church out of formal habit?
And again, they didn't go much, so I don't even know that we could call it a habit. My grandfather, what appealed to him about Norman Vincent Peale was literally that message, the power of positive thinking. Whether or not he read the book, I don't know. I highly doubt it. We had a room in my grandparents' house, which was called the library. It's the room we spent most of our time, and there were no books in it. So, I would be shocked if he'd read it, but he needed that message to bolster his own belief that you, as a man, you are in charge of your own destiny. Whatever happens to you, good or bad, is your fault or something for which you can take credit. And because my grandfather was very successful and he organized his life in such a way that he was in control of everything, he was also incredibly well connected. It was easy for him because everything went his way. So of course he was happy to take responsibility. But then with my dad, who was quite sick, he was an alcoholic, and in my grandfather's view, failed to live up to his role as the oldest son, namesake, and potential heir to the empire. It was quite easy for my grandfather to blame my father for what he perceived to be his son's shortcomings. The other thing about the power of positive thinking that was something that worked to my grandfather's benefit and worked against the rest of us was it allowed him to avoid responsibility for taking care of anybody. Because if something happened to you, you just weren't being positive enough about it. And when you have, again, a son who is ill with the disease of alcoholism and a wife who had very serious osteoporosis and was in the hospital all the time, it was very, very easy for him to absent himself because he just couldn't be around such negative things.
Mary, I've read both of your books about your family and realized I'd never thought about just how hard it must be to be associated with the Trump name. And you've said that you went into lockdown long before COVID, right after Trump won his first election in 2016. Could you talk a bit about the trauma you've experienced because President Donald Trump is your uncle?
Sure. This may not be obvious to many people, but as somebody who's known him my whole life, obviously, and as a New Yorker, what happened in 2016 was unthinkable. In 2015 and 2016, I had many conversations with my Aunt Marianne about how absurd it was that anybody would vote for Donald, that he would ever get the Republican nomination. We thought it was a joke. We thought it was a publicity stunt because it always had been in the past. And, to use my aunt's language, he's a clown and nobody's going to take him seriously. What we didn't understand is how other people outside of New York thought. We didn't realize that people outside of New York bought the myth perpetuated by The Apprentice, for example. So it was a bit of a shock, even though it probably shouldn't have been. And I took the 2016 election very, very hard. I took it very personally. And I think that the simplest explanation for that is it was one more instance in which this person, whom I knew to be a horrible human being, was not just getting away with it, but being allowed to fail upward. And again, after what he had participated in doing to my father, it was unbearable. And I also happened to live in a quite Republican town, which hadn't mattered before. I'd always had friends who were Republicans. It wasn't an issue. We had our disagreements, sure. But generally speaking, these were people who believed in most of the things I believed in. They just didn't want to pay taxes. That was sort of the divide. But once Donald was the nominee and it became clear that they were going to vote for him, despite my personal history with him, despite how horrifically he treated my dad and me, and by extension, my daughter, even though they've never met, my relationship with them became quite complicated. And in the wake of the election, I lost almost all of my friends in that town. And I became very isolated. And I found it harder and harder to go outside. And I became, I basically obsessively watched MSNBC and was constantly doom scrolling on Twitter. And the problem was, though, because I had the same last name, I was not at all comfortable participating in some of these communities I could have been part of. So, so lockdown for me started on November 9th, 2016.
But you've written that writing the book, your first book about your family, Too Much and Never Enough, gave you a podium or a role.
Yeah, that was extraordinarily helpful. And in fact, it started a little earlier when when the New York Times approached me, and I eventually decided to start helping them with their brilliant investigative report into my family's finances. That made me feel, it was completely anonymous. I never had any intention of being public about that ever. That made me feel like I was contributing something. I didn't know if it would matter. And unfortunately, it didn't matter enough. Like that seemed to be the case, even though it was so stunning and so extraordinarily well done. It should shock us that piece alone wasn't enough, but nothing ever seemed to be. So after that piece came out in October of 2018, I felt like I had a story to tell. And now was the time, because a lot of people didn't know who Donald Trump was in 2016. And, people don't pay that much attention, unfortunately. So I felt a responsibility to make sure that I could inform people to the extent that I could before they went in to the voting booth in November of 2020.
And besides your books, you also have a regular Substack blog. It's called The Good in Us. Where does that title come from?
It actually comes from a paraphrased quote from Oscar Wilde. I wish I had it memorized. It's a great quote. But it essentially is about how difficult it can be sometimes to be a good person, and that we are the worst things about us are often the things that become operative. And my goal with the Substack is to hang on to the good in us, and despite the challenges we face, which is something I understand as a member of my family. It could be very, very challenging to hang on to the best things about being human when you're surrounded by monsters.
Well, let's look at a brief clip from your Substack.
There are many, many people and parties and entities to blame. But above all, let's not forget that the largest share of the blame rests with Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party, which for decades now has been undermining what makes this country a democracy, has been weakening our institutions and breaking our norms to the point where they have been able to use, over the last 4 decades or more, the rules of our democracy, the rules of the Senate, against us, to the point where it became almost logically inevitable that we would end up with a miscreant, a thug, a criminal, a rapist, a fraudster, and a traitor sitting in the Oval Office.
Wow, that's telling it like it is. And I think I heard you use the word sociopath as well. Would that be an appropriate word?
For Donald, no. I think to use the term for him is reasonable, just like calling him a narcissist is reasonable. The reason I don't is because as a psychologist, labeling somebody with terms like that requires diagnosing them, which is a process. And he's not my patient for obvious reasons. He never would be, he never could be. And he's never been diagnosed. This is somebody who would never sit for a battery of psychological tests. So in order to reach a diagnosis, you have to go through hours and hours of testing, hours and hours of data analysis, and then writing a report, et cetera. So it's just for a very technical reason. I don't use terms like that to describe him, although I completely understand why other people do, and I think they should feel comfortable, because quite honestly, we have a plethora of evidence that would bolster the use of such terms. But I also think we're at a point where it doesn't necessarily matter, because just look at what he's doing to us. His motives don't even matter anymore. Look what he's doing.
We are talking with Mary Trump, and when we come back from the break, we're going to ask you, how did your family create the world's most dangerous man?
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name is Bill, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I don't really care what you believe, and I don't really think that you should care what I believe. I was raised in South Dakota in a strict Catholic family. I was an altar boy. I served Mass a lot of Sundays twice. The priest gave us this little card that said, "In case of accident, please call a priest." I don't really like that idea anymore since I left the church about 40 years ago. Now, if you find me alongside the road after an accident, please call an ambulance and an EMT.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. Our guest today, Mary L. Trump, is the author of the insightful bestsellers, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, and the new memoir, Who Could Ever Love You?
So Mary, in a nutshell, how did your family create the world's most dangerous man?
We have to go back a ways because it has almost everything to do with Donald's early developmental history, his psychological development. And I don't mean to create any compassion for him at all, but if we're going to be human beings, I think it is fair to have compassion for the 5 children both of my grandparents destroyed, and that would include my dad. But the most important relationships that to focus on in order to help us understand Donald are the relationship between my grandfather, my dad, who again was the oldest, the namesake, and the heir to the empire, and my grandfather and Donald, who was 7.5 years younger than my dad, and between the 2 sons. My grandfather was a sociopath, legitimately. He only was interested in other people to the extent they could be of use to him. And really the only person in the family of use to him was my dad, because again, he was supposed to carry on the Trump name and the empire. For reasons that are difficult to understand, eventually my grandfather found my dad wanting. But he focused on him for at least the first 15 years of my dad's life. And Donald, from the vantage point of being 7.5 years younger, witnessed a lot along the way. But the most crucially important first thing that happened in Donald's life was at 2.5, his mother, my grandmother, became very seriously ill and was essentially absent both physically and emotionally, for about a year. So again, Donald was 2.5. The youngest of them, Robert, was about 1. These are extraordinarily crucial periods in a child's developmental history. So at that period of time, Donald was essentially, and would be how he experienced it, abandoned by his primary caregiver, abandoned by the only person who nurtured him to the extent my grandmother did, who filled his needs and was able to do things like mirror him, which is essentially a way, mirroring an infant is essentially how we teach our children empathy. It's how we teach them how to make sense of their emotions in the context of the broader world. Instead of that, Donald had my grandfather, the sociopath. So for a year, this very young child was alone. He was afraid, and his needs went unmet. So in order to protect himself against those, what must have been quite horrific terrors, he developed very serious defense mechanisms, to the point where, over time, he became incapable of taking in anything. He became incapable of dealing with the rules of the world. He became a bully. He became arrogant. He became off-putting. And I think if things had gone differently, if my grandmother had been able to repair some of the damage that had been done by her absence, maybe there would have been hope for him. But the problem for Donald is that at about the same time my grandfather was realizing that my dad was not the person he wanted him to be, he started focusing his attention on Donald, and my grandfather actually valued what most of us would consider seriously negative characteristics that Donald had developed to protect himself. And they got nurtured. And it's a much longer story, but the short version is, here we are.
Wow.
So, and all of that just worsened over time. And I think it's safe to say that even though this has not always been true, we are at the point where Donald Trump no longer experiences any kind of empathy for other human beings at all.
To change the subject to you, I found some of your memoir nostalgic, things I remember from my childhood, like buying 2 sticks of gum for a penny to share with a friend in summer camp and that kind of thing. But a lot of your story is very sad, and some of it is even harrowing. Why did you go on to write a more personal memoir, Who Could Ever Love You?
I mean, I guess the short, very unsatisfying answer is because I owed my publisher a book. But, I could have written about anything. I think, honestly, it has more to do with the fact that I wasn't doing well. I'd never taken a break after the first book came out, never taken a break after the first election. And I was really struggling. And, I was getting my work done, but I was becoming increasingly isolated. I still felt like I was in COVID lockdown in 2023, basically, and part of 2024. And I was under an enormous amount of stress. And every once in a while, because I have the Substack and I have a YouTube channel and I do media hits, so I get comments from people. And oftentimes, people would say things like, it's sort of amazing you survived this family. Your parents must have been amazing. And they weren't. And it kind of offended me, actually. And even though, it's a very personal book and maybe I reveal more than I should, I wanted to explain what was really the case, because it just didn't seem fair that people have been making assumptions about me my whole life, of course. And of course, when my first book came out, 100% of the time, the assumptions people made about me were bad. I was yet another Trump looking for the grift. I was looking for my 15 minutes of fame, what have you. So I've experienced that my whole life, and to have people make assumptions about me in the context of that just really bothered me, because the truth of the matter is, for whatever reasons, I survived somehow, sort of intact, the family. It's certainly not because of my parents.
So we have just a minute left. It's obvious that your uncle has not really ever read the Bible. Why do you think his most fervent base are evangelical white Christians?
Yeah, first of all, I've read the Bible more than most white evangelicals, that's for sure, as literature, but still. I think it's because many churches, I guess, congregations among those kinds of so-called Christians are misleading the people in them. They're lying to them. It seems as if the entire New Testament is no longer operative in these sects, and they have a very dark vision of the world. They see Donald Trump and basically any Republican as a way to create the kind of Christian nation they think America should be, wrongly, of course. They believe America is a Christian nation, which it is not. It says that explicitly in the Constitution. And I think over decades, when your position is taken by people in power, and you are granted privileges not extended to other groups, you begin to believe that you're right and everybody else is wrong. You mentioned in the clip you played, I spoke quite negatively about Mitch McConnell, and I seriously think people like Mitch McConnell and others have as their goal to turn America into some kind of Christian theocratic apartheid state.
Yeah.
We agree with you, and we're so sorry we're out of time, but please come and hear Mary Trump speak and sign books at FFRF's 48th Annual National Convention in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in mid-October. And thank you so much, Mary, for telling it like it is. Keep doing that, and for joining us today.
Thank you so very much. This was great.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.